I hear the beat of the drums coming out of the door. I've heard it many times, but I come back for more. So I step inside and have a seat at the corner of the bar.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Two Psychologists Walk Into a Bar. Thanks for joining us. Today we have a very special guest. As you know, at AlbumHealth, we use your emotional health score, or YES, to assess your emotional functioning. And we use health behaviors to help you increase your YES, help you increase your emotional health score. Today, we have somebody who fits really nicely into that model of what we do. His name's Dr. Jacob Meyer. He's an assistant professor of kinesiology at Iowa State University, and he is an expert on the neurobiological effects of exercise on depression. So he's established the Wellbeing and Exercise Laboratory at Iowa State in Ames, Iowa. It's called the WellX Lab, Aaron, for all the cool kids, the WellX Lab on campus.
WellX.
Studies the psychological and biological effects of exercise for major depressive disorder, but also general mood disorders. His primary focus of the research is on depression, but also has an interest in aerobic and resistance exercise and the prevention of all types of psychological concerns. So anxiety, stress, fatigue, those kinds of areas. I thought it was a great discussion with Jacob. What did you think, Aaron?
I thought it was fantastic. It really helps, I think it will help everybody listening to position exercise to move the needle on your mental health. We talked about frequency of exercise, intensity of exercise, duration. Those are always three things you're looking to tweak. It got into mindfulness. I mean, there's an array of topics we discussed, and hearing his background too, and sort of personally the journey that he had that brought him into this field of research and some of his upcoming projects as well. Just a true expert. So it was a great conversation.
Yeah. And we came to realize through our discussion, the one thing that you can do to help yourself feel better. And I'm not going to tell you what that is right now. You got to listen to the podcast to find that out. But there's just one thing you have to do, and you're going to feel better.
Yep.
So
great discussion.
Yeah. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Dr. Jacob Meyer.
I'm interested to hear, I think we are interested to hear just your background and ground us in sort of where you come from and what your passions are and, how you got to be doing what you're doing, right? And then, going into your work at Iowa State and probably before that, what your passion projects have been.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Let's see. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. I went to my undergraduate at St. Olaf College in Minnesota, not too far. And then back to the University of Wisconsin for graduate school in exercise psychology. So I'm really interested in the way that the body is intertwined with the brain. And obviously we know that they relate to each other, but I was really struck by the intersection in particular, as I'm someone who's always played soccer. Was one of my primary sports growing up, and I played that at St. Olaf. And I noticed that when there were periods of time when I wasn't playing, or just through the way that seasons work, or injuries or other reasons, that my mental health really suffered. And then when I started playing again, or I switched to a different sport or whatever, it would really improve. And I started to think about, what is it about the way that people move, and maybe the environments or the physiological responses to movement, that is intertwined with the way that we think and we feel. And that really is what drove me to go down the path of trying to find out more about that in graduate school. And so in graduate school, I did really trying to get into kind of the neurobiology of when people move, what happens, and how does that relate to the way that they think and feel, and in particular in people with clinical mental health conditions. So I've suffered from depression in the past, and I noticed that that's really kind of cycled in concert, sort of in anti-concert with my own activity, and trying to figure out like how and why that is the case. So my research has really been to try to figure out, well, what do we know about how exercise influences mental health? And then both in terms of general relationships, but also in terms of how. And then once we've identified those things, how can we get exercise and movement to be an intentional, beneficial part of treatment for people with mental health conditions? And then I came to Iowa State in 2016. And then I've kept on doing that sort of work ever since.
Awesome.
Nice.
Awesome. Very cool. So your own experiences in soccer, you notice differences based on time of season and your actual physical activity. That was the seed that, all these plants have grown since then. I have to say, on the soccer front, who's your team?
Newcastle.
Ooh. Okay.
Newcastle. I've been a Newcastle fan since I lived in England during 6th grade, and Alan Shearer played for Newcastle then, and even now I kind of look like him in that we have strong genes. Anyway, but he was my favorite player, and so then when I was, what is that, like 11, I picked, and then you're stuck.
Yeah.
Newcastle has the referee uniforms, and I've heard if you're at the stadium there that you smell the hops from the ale being brewed.
I've been to a couple matches, and I've only sat way up in the nosebleeds where you can smell it pretty well.
You really can?
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, you can smell all sorts of things at a soccer match. Those around you, but
I'm guessing that's true. Well, John, do you have a team too?
I don't have a soccer team. Nope.
I do.
But I love the beer. So if I was going to choose a soccer team, it could very well be Newcastle, because I think it's a fine beer.
I like it.
It is a good beer. That's really a gold standard beer to me. It's brown. It has the hops. So before we had all these IPAs, you would get hops there. And then I'm a Chelsea fan.
Mm-hmm.
Just son started playing. Oh, I need to watch this to understand what's going on. And Chelsea was on, and it was the Drogba days where they were really good. And I was like, this dude's great. What a team. So that now I'm unfortunately an avid Chelsea fan, and they've kind of, an American owns them now, and it's not been good.
All over the place.
Yeah.
No judgment.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Good. So the talking about beer. So as you know, this is called Two Psychologists Walk Into a Bar. And so we had this concept of just having a conversation with people around mental health and their interests while having an adult beverage. So this is the real question of the day. What's your beverage of choice right now?
Well, my beverage of choice, you probably can't tell just by looking at it. It's a Fantasy Factory from Carbon 4. It's a brewery in Madison, Wisconsin.
Okay.
And the picture itself is a picture on it, the logo of a unicorn breathing fire who's being ridden by a cat with, I don't know what type of firearm that is. But it's just like the most intense picture that I can imagine. But the beer itself is really good. It's an IPA. And the reason why I like them in particular is because my parents who live in Madison, their neighbor was one of the brewers. And so he would drop off a 6-pack of this, which is, their sort of flagship beer regularly. So it's got a special place.
Nice. Are you able to buy that locally, or do you have to get it back from Wisconsin?
No, I have to get it shipped through the black market.
Oh, no. Okay. Nice.
That's a beautiful art on it in particular. It looks like it tastes really good.
Yeah, well, it's definitely intense.
All right, JB, let's hear it.
Well, I am having I often go whiskey, but today I went gin and tonic.
Oh.
It's a little early in the day yet. So I had having a gin and tonic. And it's a gin that I recently found. I was making a cocktail for a fire pit night, and it had apple cider and I don't remember what else was in it, but it had like sparkling apple cider, and I think agave was in it. And then it called for this specific gin. Couldn't find the gin. It was very expensive gin, but couldn't find it in our state. And landed on this one because it's a barreled gin. And so it's got a little bit of a yellowish color because it was aged for a little while in barrels, and it's a peppery gin, which I wanted because more so than the floral notes, because I wanted something to go with kind of that orange. I think it used the orange bitters in the drink too, maybe. But anyway, the peppery was a better fit for me for that drink, and so I'm having that with a Fever Tree tonic water, which is a less sweet tonic. It's a little more on the sour side. I kind of like that today. So Tatterstall is the name of the gin, by the way. Tattersall.
Tatterstall?
Tatter. With a T. Tattersall.
Jacob, you know what he's talking about. I see you nodding your head a lot. No.
No, but it all sounds good. I mean, I'd probably.
John, we, in our recent journey to bourbon territory and going through Indiana, I recall we tried a gin from the distillery in Indiana, right?
Yes, Starlight Distillery.
So that would have been barrel made as well, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I'm not sure. You don't have to do barrels because gin is often clear.
Right.
So I'm not sure if they aged theirs or not. I don't recall. I do know that gin is very widely made in Scotland and England. It's kind of the number 2 spirit next to what we call Scotch whiskey. So,
yeah, I remember trying the gin, Jacob, and I'm on this bourbon trip, and it was my second one, and I'm an okay fan of bourbon, but I like the gin the most. And I was like, oh, I like the gin more than any of the bourbon. It's a bourbon trip. And everybody's all in on bourbon, but I like gin quite a bit. So good pick. All right. I went with beer as well. I went with an IPA as well. This is my favorite beer. I'd say by a significant amount. It's, as you would expect. Oh no. It is Toppling Goliath's Pompeii.
Nice.
Which both of you know it, I assume.
Yep.
Yeah.
Both of you approve of my choice?
Approved.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. It's got that citrus element you like.
It's very citrusy. It's very refreshing. Yeah, I like it more than Pseudo Sue. I like it more than King Sue, which is a little too powerful. But for people not around Iowa, Toppling Goliath is a must visit, and that whole area up in Decorah is just spectacular. I'm guessing when you were at St. Olaf, you played Luther. Did you? So you got to play soccer. The pitch, John, it's called the pitch, is down at the bottom of a hill, and the fields are all blue at Luther, I believe.
Yeah, you're
right?
kind of at the bottom of, I don't know, everything comes up around you. It's a pretty cool place to play.
Yeah, beautiful area.
Mm-hmm.
Really nice.
Yeah, maybe the next round we'll meet there.
Heck yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. There's another brewery there, Pulpit Rock, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've been there too, and I haven't been to the new Toppling Goliath. Apparently, it's a whole new big brewery a little outside of town, and they're making one here in Des Moines, over in the Drake neighborhood. So that'll be neat when they get that up. But Pompeii.
Good choice.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, and just as a reminder to our viewers and listeners, CDC guidelines recommend 2 drinks or less. If you choose to drink, CDC guidelines recommend 2 drinks or less for men per day, one drink or less for women per day. And if you're unsure or think you may need help with your drinking, call 1-800-662-HELP. That's 1-800-662-4357, and they can connect you with someone in your area to help you take a look at your drinking behaviors.
We're really pumped to have you here. And just to preface the conversation, if I have in my world, this is exactly how this podcast goes, and here's how this all goes, Jacob, just so you know, and I don't want to impose my will, but at AlbumHealth, we have a self-management solution called YES, which is YEHS, your emotional health score. So we, number one, measure emotional health. Half of the measurement comes from a symptoms rating scale, which I know you're very accustomed to reading your methods sections. We use the DAS-21, so depression, anxiety, and stress is half of YES. And the other half is health behaviors. So it's specifically, we're tracking adherence to prescribed chosen health behaviors. Exercise is one of the core pillars. And we derive YES from, okay, what's the health behavior activity you're doing and what are the behaviors you're doing? And the other side, symptoms, that becomes the score. And we're always looking to help people in an evidence-based way self-manage, so they understand how to position things like exercise to improve their mental health. So that's why this discussion is so important, because what I hope is that we can understand the research and the knowledge that you've accumulated over time, but it can also, in the end, help people develop their plan and develop specific exercises that best target, where they are. So whether it's prevention or treatment, and even some other demographic variables, my hope is that we can share knowledge here and talk about things that can help people actually develop a plan. And what I know is that you also, in the program, I'm a master's level graduate of the program you're in right now, as a professor, actually do the behaviors, because I know there's a psychological component. It's all great what's prescribed, but what do people actually do? What's will they do is kind of the bottom line. The best plan is the best exercise is the exercise you'll do. Right? So with that said, I know John and I have a lot of questions and items, but would you mind just sort of telling us, some of your current research? You're doing some really exciting work related to CBT. That caught my eye quickly. The CBD plus, as it was advertised, but you're looking at cognitive behavioral therapy, medication, and how exercise interacts with those two to drive better outcomes is roughly what you're looking at?
Yeah, that's a good preface, kind of summary of it. Yeah, so the CBT Plus project is trying to figure out, we know that there's lots of different options for people who have depression, who have other mental health concerns, some of which are effective for some people. But for lots of people, for various reasons and many unknown, a certain thing doesn't work. And so we're trying to figure out, are there some ways for us to make our current treatment options more effective, or more effective for more people, or maybe more effective more quickly? And so one of the routes that we're going down is looking at, what if we can, when we talk with therapists in particular, they'll sometimes be frustrated, maybe isn't quite the right word, but we'll talk about how it can take, of a standard 50-minute therapy session, and it can take 40 or 45 minutes to get the person out of their shell to the point at which they're actually willing to have a conversation that's, gonna help move somewhere. And the lament is like, if I could get how productive we are in those 10 minutes at the very end after the shell comes open, if I could get a whole session like that, that would be incredible. We could get so much stuff done. And so what we're trying to figure out is there some way for us to make that happen by preparing people for therapy in such a way that that we can open the shell, basically prime someone to respond to that therapy session. And so what we're looking at is either having people engage in exercise right before their therapy session, so that when they get done with the exercise, they then are more energetic, more interested in engaging, sort of out of their shell a little bit. And then they, when they walk into the therapy office, they're ready to start talking and ready to start listening as well to what is coming the other way. And then that's one condition or one idea. And then the other idea is having people go through sort of a structured nature experience. We know that exposure to nature is really important for the way that people feel both in the moment, and then also, there's enduring effects of being exposed to nature. And we're looking at if people can be exposed to nature for 30 minutes right beforehand, does that also kind of open their interest in the engagement with a subsequently performed therapy session? And so we're looking at CBT plus to see basically everybody gets CBT and then they get plus something else, either exercise right before or this calm nature condition right before. And then we'll see over the course of an 8-week intervention which group ends up responding better, maybe responding quicker, maybe developing a relationship between the therapist and the client at a faster speed or to a deeper level based upon what people might be up to right beforehand. With the idea being that if we could come up with ways to make therapy more effective, CBT could be one piece of it, but it could also just be therapy in general. So we're really trying to figure out if there's some ways that we can make what we've got going on right now from a treatment perspective, enhance the effectiveness.
Are there any parameters for the exercise itself, like around mindfulness or things people should be thinking about while they're doing their exercise?
Yeah, good question. So what we're looking at right now is just a moderate intensity biking session. So basically something that would be doable by most everybody, stationary bicycle recumbent, in the experimental design of the project that we have going on right now. But theoretically, it could be, from a translational perspective, it could be as simple as instead of, driving to your therapy appointment, just biking to it, or actively transporting to it in some fashion. Maybe that's walking, maybe that's jogging, however you can get there. But maybe that in and of itself, just the way that you're getting from place A to place B, is going to make it so that when you're at place B, you can engage more effectively. So that's what we're trying to look at. And, we don't know what the answers are yet. That's why we do the research. But I think that's, there's lots of ways that we could think about maybe manipulating what that exercise experience is to make it more effective. Maybe like a group exercise right before group therapy, or, there's different ways to think about how that could work.
Yeah. Okay. And I know in the past, you've also looked at the role of exercise, kind of the interaction, I guess, really, of exercise with antidepressants. What kinds of things did you find from that research that you did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've looked at some, systematic reviews and meta-analyses across all the literature that's out there to try to figure out, if someone starts an exercise program or they start medication, which one is going to be more effective. And in general, what it looks like is that if you start exercise or you start a medication, you're going to have roughly the same likelihood of going into depression remission with either one. So exercise seems to be as effective as medication. And for some reason that isn't totally clear, when you add them both together, it doesn't seem to necessarily give you more benefit. So potentially they're working through the same mechanisms, or like how they're working is the same. So if you do both of them at once, it's not necessarily going to give you any added benefit. But there's so little research that really looks at the combination piece that we don't have great data to really support whether or not adding them is going to be more helpful. And for some people who have like treatment-resistant depression, for example, adding exercise on top of a medication regimen that might not be able to handle it on its own does seem to be helpful. So, I don't know if edge cases is the right way to say it, but there's some ways to think about exercise being, an option just like antidepressants, and then also potentially useful if you add on top for some folks.
Can you get into some of the why. Why does exercise help with depression? Why do medications? You're alluding to they're kind of acting in similar ways. You don't see this additive potentiated effect here. So can you
Yeah.
take us into that world? Because I know that's a passion.
Yeah, we can dip our toes into it. Don't have to go too crazy. I mean, it's interesting because it's so part of the problem why depression and mental health treatment identification is so tricky is because there's no single underlying issue from a biological standpoint. You can't say like, oh, you've got too much depression protein, we're just going to tamp that down and you're going to be fine. You know, same for anxiety, same for stress, in similar ways. And because there's no single biomarker system, it's really hard to say, how are you treating depression? Because depression itself is sort of multifaceted in its origins and in the way that it looks between people and even within people over time. So that's like what makes depression hard, as well as other mental health conditions hard. And then from a treatment perspective, when you've got a treatment like exercise that influences every system in the body, it's hard to say like, here's exactly what it's doing that's hitting this sort of diffuse issue of depression. So you sort of got like a diffuse issue on one end, the target of depression, and a diffuse issue on the other end, the exposure of exercise, making it so there's not a clear link between how exercise is helping treat depression. That's a number of sort of strong candidate either groups or mechanisms of things that seem to be how exercise could be helping. A couple of the primary ones are thinking about the monoamines or the monoaminergic systems. So things like serotonin and dopamine as well, as things that we know exercise leads to either increased availability or increased release of, similar to ways that some drugs do. So you could sort of think about exercise being able to target the same systems that like SSRIs and SNRIs are targeting. So if exercise is doing the same thing that those drugs are doing, then doing them simultaneously might not get you any benefit. But we also know that exercise is also doing lots of other things at the same time. So it's releasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that's involved in sort of growth and survival of neurons, and in particular involved in the way that like we learn and build new connections. So if you think about something like depression, people come out of depression often by creating new connections or new ways to deal with maladaptive, potentially thought processes, where you have to have some way to make those changes happen or make those new connections happen. And exercise might be able to do that by releasing or making available more brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which you can sort of think of as like fertilizer for the brain. So it creates an environment in which new connections can be made more easily. So serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, BDNF are some of the primary mechanistic candidates for how exercise might be able to help treat or manage mental health symptoms, though it's not very clear exactly which one it is, because in particular in people, you can't administer something that's going to block, BDNF, or you can't take out a little piece of someone's brain and figure out what's exactly happening right in here when someone exercises. So it's pretty tricky to do those studies to really figure it out. But some of the animal modeling work has at least pointed us in those directions for answers.
Yeah. I think anecdotally from doing therapy over the years, I found for the vast majority of people, exercise was very helpful for depression. I think a combination of maybe biochemical changes, but also the self-efficacy of, hey, I'm doing something, I'm taking action, and kind of those positive thoughts that come from that. But there was always this small group of people who it seemed like when they would start to exercise, or not just start, but when they would exercise, they would get much more kind of emotionally raw. And it seemed like, they would become more anxious and kind of a little more paranoid of relationships or interactions they had and kind of second guessing things a lot. And it was a small group of people, but I never could really pinpoint why that was happening, I kind of concluded, well, where the exercise is unlocking some emotion that's just not getting processed very well. And so it's helping them access that better and causing this. But I wonder if in your research, if you've ever come across that subset of people and what you make of that, if it's something you've encountered.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, in research, typically what we do is we look at the average. So we look at the mean change on average, here's how much better people get. But there's always a person or two who's not getting better, and a person or two who's sort of going in the opposite direction. And, I think when we look at those individual differences, it's really fascinating to try to figure out, like, okay, what's happening here that's getting us to have a different response than what your average patient X would look like. And so I think in some cases it's possible that it's sort of a rumination concern. So especially something like aerobic exercise, you go for a jog, you do the same thing for 30 minutes, you've got time to let your mind kind of wander, assuming you're not pushing yourself really hard and you can't do anything but think about that. But if you're in sort of a steady state, you might be able to think a lot. And some people thinking a lot is good, and sometimes thinking a lot isn't so helpful. And in particular, in people who have high rumination, that could be an issue. It's not something that I've studied, so that's certainly speculative in terms of thinking about what could be going on. But I think all across the exercise literature, we see that, like, on average, the recommendation should be, exercise is helpful for physical health, for emotional health, for mental health, across the board. But that, in some cases, people either take it too far or, just like in anything in life, there's reactions that aren't what you expect. And I think those are always really interesting to try to figure out what's going on. Why not? And sometimes when you go down those paths, then that can lead you to help understand why it's happening in the first place. There might be something along with the mechanism of how exercise actually normally works that is off in this person. And that, can point you to how it's working for everybody else.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, definitely an individual difference there for some people, but again, a very small, in my experience, a very small number of people.
Yeah.
I'm like you, Jacob, different sport, baseball, but when I was not physically active, I'm more of an anxiety person, and would get some depression secondary to anxiety, like, when is this ever going to leave, type of response. But if I don't, I mean, to this day, I am a habitual aerobic and anaerobic person. And I do feel like I get a little bit stronger of a response related to my mood if I go out for a run, and extend it in some of the time. And I try to really titrate what works well and what yields the best outcomes. And I think at the end, maybe we'll settle on some of the recommendation pieces, but that's always been, when I'm practicing and when I was researching, that was always an interest of mine, was sort of aerobic versus anaerobic, what drives the best outcomes, frequency, intensity, duration, manipulating those variables. What are you generally finding in the mental health space? And I know you're specifically mood disorders and depression is sort of your target. Do you have any rules that you've concluded?
Yeah. Fascinating question. And I could talk for, the rest of the season about this, but probably. But I think, like, one of the biggest questions there that people always ask is, like, is it aerobic or anaerobic? Like, should I be lifting or should I be running, and, like, or, jogging or doing whatever version of that, I do. And it's really interesting when we look at, like, the sum of all of the research, that either starting an aerobic program or starting a resistance program have almost identical effects in terms of reductions in depression. So essentially, they give you the same benefit, on average. So it's interesting, then it kind of comes down to the thing that you said at the beginning, like, the best exercise prescription is the one that you're going to do, So then maybe for people who lean more towards one or the other, that is going to be more impactful. And actually, I talked about the CBT Plus project, but the research evidence within people who have people who have clinical depression, the resistance training literature is really sparse. There's like 6 trials, all of them with less than 20 people. We have very little actual research there, though we can see like, well, what's the effect of resistance training on depressed mood in people with other conditions? We don't actually have much in people who have a clinical depressive condition. And so we're just launching a trial that's going to have 200 people in it, looking at resistance training as the intervention for people with depression, and trying to look at how resistance training specifically might be able to treat depression, and looking at some brain blood flow parameters as the mechanism through which that might work. So hopefully we'll be able to contribute something really useful in that space in terms of trying to figure out how useful is resistance training and how might that work for depression. But the big picture take home right now is aerobic or resistance is going to give you roughly the same benefit for depression. And the other mental health disorders, there's just like depression has the best evidence base, and then the other ones tend to have less. So anxiety seems to be relatively similar, and there's maybe some cool stuff in anxiety about how resistance training might provide sort of like a similar physiological response as anxiety symptoms. You have a really brief increase in heart rate, increase in breathing rate, increase in blood pressure that is similar to some, acute anxiety symptoms. And so resistance training might be particularly helpful for something like anxiety, where you're sort of getting like a exposure therapy in a way, controlled exposure to similar physiological sensations. Yep. So anyway, more to be done there, but in general, it looks like resistance or aerobic, pick the one that you're going to do, not just this week, but also next week.
So type doesn't really matter. What doing it matters.
Doing it matters.
I know this is a whole season. I agree. We could probably geek out on type, and we can't, but frequency, intensity, duration. I'm guessing, just confirm. I'll do my best. Frequency, more frequent the better. Intensity, I listen to a lot of biohackers and Peter Attia and Huberman, and everybody's into zone 2 cardio right now. So I want to hear your take on zone 2 cardio, because I know you're bombarded with that. So yeah, I'll kind of stop. I would say frequency, more is better. Intensity, moderate to higher intensity is better, although zone 2 is a little bit lower. And then duration, that there's some threshold there around an hour. Those are my stabs. How did I do?
I'll give you a BC.
Let's go with B.
B. Round up. If we put the curve in, you're good. I would say, so I'm gonna take these backwards in terms of interest level. I'm gonna go with duration first. We know that at least 20 minutes, but even getting a few minutes in is helpful. But 20 minutes, people start to get sort of into more of a steady state where they're engaging in the same thing over time, and your body starts to sort of adapt in a particular way. So try to think about bouts that last that long or longer. Hour is fine, and beyond is good too. But trying to set a threshold to start. Intensity, moderate intensity. Really, zone 2 is totally fine. Even I did some work in my dissertation where we looked at having people do either a light intensity exercise, moderate intensity, or hard intensity, and then looked at the acute mood response to each of those. This population was women who were depressed, and light was as good as moderate, was as good as hard in terms of the amount of improvement, or the amount that their depressed mood state came down. Oh. So even going for something, sort of that might seem mild could be helpful. But if you're thinking about trying to do something sort of repeatedly over time, and maybe thinking about, trying to create a program, then we know that light intensity stuff is not likely to lead to improvements over time. So that's why I sort of bump up a little bit. But if the idea is like, I'm just feeling crummy and I need to feel better, walking around your block at a light intensity, that's going to kick the monkey either, if not off your back, at least over a little bit, to where you can start to feel a little bit better. So frequency is the last piece. So that's the intensity piece, moderate at least. Frequency, I think, is really interesting because what you look at here is not just like how many times per week to do it, but also sort of like how to spread it out. And I think frequency is cool because we know that as soon as somebody exercises, and then for a little while after they're exercising, they feel differently. And for some of the mental health benefits, it looks like it lasts maybe a few hours after that last session. And in some cases, it might even last a day or so after you exercise. So you might feel better for sort of like the next 24 hours. Well, if that's the case, then we get people to exercise even at a relatively small amount of exercise, but daily.
Right.
That they're always under the effect of the last time that they exercised. So they never really get back to whatever their baseline was. And so we can sort of have someone who's living on average under the effects of exercise in a way that is probably really helpful from a psychological perspective. And so I think the frequency piece is a cool way for us to think about like how can we sort of maximize over the course of someone's life the benefits of exercise. Well, that would be to break exercise into smaller chunks, but just to do it on a more frequent basis, because that'll get you, you'll regularly reap the benefits rather than it being an isolated once a week benefit that goes away for then the next 5 days until you do it again. So that's my take.
Type doesn't matter. What you'll do, frequency, daily with small little, you want to be dosing. Basically, you think of it as the medication you're taking on a daily basis. Intensity is moderate. Duration is 20 minutes. That's what brought me down to a B, is I went too high there. Apologies on that one.
Well, and for those who don't know, what is zone 2? I'm asking for a friend.
Yeah, Aaron, you wanna?
Oh, all right. I'll ask for a comment. I do wear a Whoop band. I am a believer in the Whoop band. We have no affiliation to Whoop, nor to any Toppling Goliath or any of the drinks that we discussed. Just a disclaimer. But zone 2 is you're at 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. Traditionally, max heart rate is 220 minus your age, and then you take 60 to 70% of that, which puts me at 105 to 125 or somewhere in that range. And if you, according to the biohacker world, if you sustain 30 minutes or more of zone 2, there are these extremely beneficial effects that occur at the mitochondrial level. That's my novice explanation.
That's pretty decent. Get some more credit than that. Yeah, so mostly what we're looking at is there's like different types of training, and a lot of this comes from really like the fitness industry world, which tends to have murky research basis. The idea of mitochondria sounds cool, and so we're going to talk a lot about it, but not necessarily have quite the same level of evidence to back it up. But it's still, the idea is that this is going to be something that people can do for a very long period of time. 60 to 70% of someone's max is not really high, especially at the 60%. 70% is a little bit higher, but so it's something that someone can do consistently over a long period of time. And something that often happens even when you're exercising is that even if you're exercising at the same intensity, if you've been doing it for 30 minutes, like your heart rate will start to creep up because your body, that like accumulation can be difficult. So to stay at the same thing, people have to start to sort of slow down a little bit over time. But in general, this would be like, for many people, depending on their fitness level, could be like a brisk walk or You know, a brisk walk might feel difficult for some, so it could just be, you know, a standard pace walk or something that you could do for an extended period of time without it necessarily being a problem for whatever you're engaging in.
Mhm.
Yep. So they're not too far off. I always wondered how they're checking on the mitochondria and changes.
I mean, there are, you know, adaptations that happen
Yeah.
at that. Yeah, mostly it's trying to come up with something that like improves, that provides like a basis for cardiorespiratory fitness. That isn't necessarily something that's going to like make someone way more fit, but it will uh, be able to sort of maintain or continue someone's fitness level.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
I know that, well, I'm aware we're getting closer to the end of our time, so, but I wanted to get a question in, hear your thoughts about the research you did on kind of increased sedentary behavior during COVID. It looked like there was quite a bit you did there. I mean, it's what would you say about that, about our movement toward working from home more, increased sedentary behaviors? Um, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, COVID was is, but you know, the initial interruption of daily life was a big change, and one of those changes that like we don't have precedent for in our modern history in terms of the way that people's lives changed so quickly, and so many people's. And I think that was really it was an opportunity for us to try to learn some things about what happens at a population level when immediately overnight everybody has to make big changes in their behavior. And so for us, this was our chance to try to like collect data to see when people do make these big changes, what's happening to their mental health, what's happening to the way that their lifestyle behaviors, like how much they sit, how much, you know, they eat, how much they, you know, use screens. And we saw that in particular, people's sitting time as soon as the public health restrictions went in place in, you know, spring of 2020, their sitting time went up, their screen time went up, and if they had previously been active, their physical activity went way down. If they weren't previously active, they didn't get negative physical activity points or anything. But in particular, we saw those as our three big changes, and then we saw each of those changes being related to people's mental health. So the more your physical activity decreased, the worse off your mental health was. The more your sitting time increased or your screen time increased, the worse off your mental health was. And we tracked people across sort of the first 2 months of the early phase of the pandemic, and that we saw that people whose sitting behavior was highest, those people tended to have the worst recovery in terms of depression. So immediately there was this big sort of acute response from both physical activity, but also from mental health, that we all changed a bunch and our mental health got worse. In part, we didn't know what was going on. It was stressful. We got new information every week, et cetera. And what we saw was that in general, over the next 2 months, people's mental health improved. But for people whose sitting behavior ended up being really high, those people, the improvements were significantly less, such that this sort of like pandemic associated increase in sitting time, if it was really high, that was associated with like lingering or sort of lasting depressive symptoms that wasn't present for other folks. So I think it really helped us to think about not just like our how much we move, but also the way that we sit and how important that is as sort of like a sneaky behavior that we don't pay a lot of attention to, but can have really important influences on the way that we feel, and how the pandemic sort of messed both of those things up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it just seems like getting up and moving, getting up and getting out, it's gonna, not only is it's reducing your screen time most likely. I mean, you can still look at a screen and do those things, but you're also potentially increasing your socialization. You're interacting with other people, even if you're just passing them on the sidewalk or at a run. And so you're really doing a lot of things to get yourself away from the screens and all that terrible content that we're constantly bombarded with. and increasing your chances of socialization with another human. So
Yeah, a lot of benefits that come with that. And part of the sitting piece is not just, you don't necessarily have to like replace sitting with running or, some high intensity activities. Some of it is just like realizing you've been sitting for a while, getting up, moving around, just kind of like resetting the body a little bit. Some of the intervention research shows that just like breaking up sitting, even with a little bit of standing or a little bit of walking around, is really helpful for like cardiometabolic health, as well as likely for also mental health.
yeah, yeah.
Sitting is the new smoking, YouTube. I know that's about 20 years old, but I figured I'd drop an old school saying.
Yeah. Sitting is
Yeah.
smoking.
So I know
when I keep thinking.
Oh, go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say, I keep thinking about my Apple Watch and all the things. It's, every 10 minutes to the hour, it's reminding me to get up. It's, it wants me to walk or wants me to do something cardio 30 minutes a day. I mean, it's got all these built-in things. Apple is welcome to sponsor us, by the way, if they'd like to. I'll be happy to plug
Please
Apple.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's so it keeps telling me stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know we're time crunched, so I guess these are shorter answers, unfortunately, but I have to hit on one research area that jumped out. It's a domain near to dear to my heart. Exercise probably number one. So if I'm looking at how I'm taking care of myself, it's certainly exercise is number one. Number two, though, relationships is obviously big, and there are some other things that are really big, but you research mindfulness-based stress reduction, and it looks like you went head to head with exercise, right? And looked at outcomes?
Yeah. During my postdoc, I worked on a project that was ongoing already. I didn't come up with it, but that looked at exercise versus mindfulness-based stress reduction. And the primary outcome was to prevent acute respiratory infection. Now, this was pre-COVID, no idea that this might actually be super relevant. But what I added to the project as the kinesiologist was trying to look at how does exercise training, so getting people into a gym, or mindfulness-based stress reduction influence people's physical activity behavior. Thinking that like sending people to the gym is going to get them to increase their physical activity, probably outside of the exercise the most. And mindfulness, if you think about mindfulness, like people are probably seated, probably not super active when they're being mindful. I thought it was going to be obviously exercise was going to be the best, then mindfulness, then the control group. But what ended up happening was that the exercise and the mindfulness had roughly the same benefit for physical activity behavior that we objectively monitored with an accelerometer compared to each other, and both better than the control group. So it really made me think, like, wait a second, if we teach people to be mindful, that's going to lead them to being more physically active on its own. And we don't even have to teach them anything about exercise. And so as someone who has drank the kinesiology Kool-Aid, it really threw me for a loop to try to figure out like how, this isn't just about exercise. This is about like behavior change in general and getting people to sort of to make healthy choices on their own for themselves. And I think that's really what it came down to for me, was thinking about how mindfulness training might be able to help us improve people's physical activity, or especially in conjunction with the physical activity program, might lead us to getting people to be much more active than they would be if we didn't also think about sort of like the psychological piece of when and why do people choose to be active.
It's an interesting finding. So is the finding that the more mindful people are, they practice mindfulness, they're more mindful, that I'm going to make a big jump, that they are more likely to engage in health behaviors? They're more likely to do things that are nurturing, right?
Yeah. I mean, potentially. So the way that I thought about it is that like mindfulness is all about the being aware and in the present moment.
Right.
And if that's what you're focused on, then as you're making choices throughout the day, you're making a choice that you're like, should I get into my car to drive to the store that's 2 blocks away, or should I walk, you're going to make probably walking is a better choice for me choice. And so you're going to consistently sort of get nudged, sort of a behavioral economics way of thinking about it, into making healthier choices regularly. And that part of those healthy choices are going to show up in terms of your activity level. Or at least that's the way that I thought about it. We really didn't get that level of data from the participants because I didn't think we were going to need to. Because I had a different idea of how things were going to end up. But it was really fascinating to me to, I love being wrong, because then you have to go back to the drawing board and figure out, like, what's wrong with my assumptions and how can I make sure that they're better going forward?
Yeah, that's interesting. It is. It taps into an old psychology concept that's been around a long time, is that we have an innate drive toward health inside of us.
Yep.
An innate drive toward, or call it better organization, or call, whatever you want to call it, but that we have this part of ourselves in our unconscious that takes care of us and moves us toward health. We just have to stop and be aware of it and be mindful of it, and we can more easily move toward that.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Okay. Crescendo time. Drum roll. So, Jacob, we've talked about some of this already, but it could be a little bit different. You're in the lab. Your lab's pretty cool. Seen the pictures, know the building. I'm assuming you're still in the Forker building, right? Yep. Okay. Beautiful Ames, and you've done lit review after lit review. So your recommendations, and again, we're looking to help people position exercise best to move the needle on their yes score. Symptoms, but also things that they'll do. So it's the exercise that they'll do. Your recommendations, both for people who are in the treatment phase. So this is somebody who has a diagnosis of MDD, for example, or some sort of mood disorder, and prevention. Both sides, go.
Ooh. Prescription is wonderfully identical for prevention and treatment. We're in the same spot. You hit on a really important point to begin with. What you're going to do matters so much more than exactly following what I say to the letter of the law. The variation between doing the optimal prescription and doing something suboptimal but as close, that difference is so minimal compared to the difference of doing something versus doing nothing. So it's much more important that we find something that people will do within the framework of the idea of the more regular physical activity can be done, the better.
Yep.
With that idea of the acute benefits that we see from each session. And, really getting up to a moderate intensity is really as high as we need to push the intensity prescription. So really finding something that you can do that you think you might like, or that you've liked in the past, and then doing it regularly. And it could just be like, okay, the thing that I'm going to do requires other people, because I'm not going to just go out and start a new Olympic weightlifting program all by myself. So I need to have a buddy, or I need to have my, sister or my spouse be involved in this with me. Find whatever it is, the things, the levers that help you make your behavior changes happen, and lean heavily into those. That's going to be really important. And then understanding that we fall off the bandwagon all the time, whatever that bandwagon is, and planning for the fact that, like, some days you're going to think that you're going to have the best intentions and it's not going to happen. And that doesn't mean that you don't exercise normally, that you're not a regular exerciser. It just means that this time, this day, it didn't happen. And that's a really important part, because a lot of people go sort of all or none, and that doesn't lead to sustained health behavior in general.
Yep.
So, we've got to give ourselves a lot of grace, I think, especially in this post-pandemic.
Yeah, it reminds me of a therapy concept I often talked about, which is motivation follows action. Just do something. Just start. Take that first step. Right. Then motivation kicks in. and then it builds, but you have to take the first step.
Yeah. With my kids, there's this thing, eating begets eating. You put something on their plate of food that they like to eat, and they eat that thing, and then they eat all the rest of the vegetables that are on their plate, which they never would eat if they didn't have that one Cheeto or whatever it was I'm excited about. So
Right.
same thing,
Yep.
physical activity. Doing it once, and you're like, oh, I kind of liked that. Yeah, I could do that again.
Yeah. Well, it's great. There we didn't even hit a sliver of my notes that I wanted to, questions I wanted to ask. And then you opened up more. I would love to have you back at some point, because as psychologists, we're trained in the biopsychosocial model, right? A way of understanding mental health and mental disorders, but also intervening. And you've really gone pretty heavily in the biological, right? But I know you pay attention to the psychological components and the social components as well, pretty heavily, right? Because that's where the do comes in. When all those are really working together, you do it. And then as far as the concept of effect size, we pay attention to, when we're guiding behaviors, 4 pillars: exercise, emotional health behaviors, nutritional behaviors, and then medical, which is usually, a medication or something like that. And exercise is kind of, it's up there at the top, right? Like you said, everybody agrees exercise works wonders across the body system. So, I didn't mean to go into a question. What's the end game? What's the end game with all the research that people will be able to, or exercise will be prescribed as sort of traditional treatment? I mean, where you get it going with all this?
Yeah, I mean, my goal is that people are active in ways that sort of optimize their health and well-being, whatever that is for that person, and that we use physical activity and exercise, in the healthiest ways that we can as a society. And, I think in general that comes in a bunch of different ways, but I think one of the primary ones is that we get more respect or utility out of it for the benefits it can have for psychological health in treatment, because that's an area that we have lots of needs, especially in Iowa, on. And using what we know works could go a long ways if we get there.
Yeah. Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks
Yeah.
you guys for having me. This was great.